The gunshot cracked through the marble lobby before Elena Marchetti had even taken off her coat, and every head in the room turned toward the elevator except hers, because she was too busy staring at the bullet hole that had just appeared in the wall 3 feet from where she stood. A security guard rushed past her, radio crackling, and a woman in a tailored suit grabbed Elena's arm and pulled her behind a pillar without a word of explanation. Elena's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat, but somehow her feet did not move to run. She had come here for a job interview, not a war zone. And yet here she was, pressed against cold stone, while men in dark suits swept the lobby with guns drawn. "You picked a bad day to show up," the woman muttered, releasing her arm once the commotion settled. "I'm Vittoria. You're here for the assistant position, aren't you?" Elena nodded, unable to find her voice. Vittoria studied her for a long moment, taking in the curve of her hips beneath her plain gray dress, the soft roundness of her face, the way she stood her ground even though her hands were shaking. "Interesting," Vittoria said, almost to herself. "Follow me. My brother doesn't like to be kept waiting, and today of all days, patience is not his strength." Elena had applied for the job 3 days earlier, out of pure necessity. Her savings had run dry after she lost her position at an accounting firm that folded overnight, and the listing for an executive assistant at Costa Enterprises had promised a salary that made her stomach flutter with relief. She had not asked too many questions about what kind of company paid that well for answering phones and managing calendars. Now, walking through a lobby still dusted with the tension of gunfire, she understood why the pay was so generous, and why, according to the recruiter who had rushed her interview through in record time, the position had been vacant 12 times in the past year. The elevator ride to the top floor felt endless. Vittoria said nothing, her eyes fixed on the numbers ticking upward, her manicured fingers tapping against her thigh. When the doors finally opened, Elena stepped into an office that looked more like the inside of a fortress than a business, all dark wood and reinforced glass, with 2 men standing guard at either side of a massive desk. Behind that desk sat Salvatore Costa. He did not look up right away. He was reading something on his phone, his jaw tight, a thin scar running along his left cheekbone that caught the afternoon light. When he finally raised his eyes to Elena, she felt the full weight of his attention land on her like a physical thing, cold and assessing, as though he were deciding whether she was worth the trouble of speaking to at all. "Sit," he said. It was not a request. Elena sat. Her hands folded themselves in her lap, though she made sure her spine stayed straight. She had read online that the previous assistants had lasted anywhere from a single day to 2 weeks. She had told herself she only needed this job for a few months, just long enough to rebuild her savings, and then she would leave on her own terms. She had not planned on gunfire in the lobby before she even reached the interview. "You heard the noise downstairs," Salvatore said. "It wasn't a question either." "Yes. And you're still sitting here." Elena met his eyes, refusing to let the fear in her chest bleed into her expression. "I need the job. Bullets don't change my rent." Something flickered across his face, gone before she could name it. He leaned back in his chair, studying her the way a man studies a puzzle he doesn't expect to solve quickly. "Most people run the moment they hear a single shot. You didn't run." "I didn't have anywhere to run to that would pay better," Elena said honestly. He almost smiled. "Almost. What do you know about my business, Miss Marchetti?" "Nothing," she admitted. "The listing said import and export consulting. I assumed it meant something dull. Spreadsheets, shipping manifests, maybe some difficult clients." "And now?" "Now I assume the clients are more difficult than I expected." This time the corner of his mouth actually lifted, just slightly, before he caught himself and smoothed his expression back into cool indifference. He glanced at Nino, the broad-shouldered man standing near the window with his arms crossed, and something passed between them that Elena couldn't read. "You have the job," Salvatore said. 3 months probation. If you last that long, we'll discuss permanent terms. And if I don't last that long, then you'll leave the way the others did, quickly, and without asking too many questions. Elena's pulse spiked at the implication, but she held his gaze. "I don't scare easily." "We'll see," Salvatore said, and turned back to his phone, dismissing her without another word. That first week tested every nerve in Elena's body. She learned quickly that the calendar she managed was not filled with client lunches and quarterly reports, but with meetings that required armed escorts, calls made on phones that were destroyed and replaced daily, and visitors who spoke in low voices and never gave their full names. She learned to recognize the sound of Nino's footsteps in the hallway, heavy and deliberate, and the lighter, quicker steps of Vittoria, who seemed to appear at random moments, just to watch Elena work, as if evaluating whether she would crack under pressure. On her third day, a man burst into the office without an appointment, shouting in a language Elena didn't understand, his hands moving wildly as he gestured toward Salvatore. Nino moved to intercept him, but Salvatore raised a hand, silencing the room with a single gesture. He listened to the man's tirade with an expression of complete calm, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost gentle, which somehow made it more frightening than if he had shouted back. The man left moments later, pale and shaking, his earlier fury replaced with something that looked a great deal like fear. Elena said nothing about the encounter, though her hands trembled as she typed up the notes from the meeting that followed. Salvatore watched her from across the room, and when she finally looked up, he was studying her face, as though searching for the crack in her composure that he expected to find. "You're not going to ask what that was about," he said. "Would you tell me if I asked?" "No." "Then there's no reason to ask." He tilted his head slightly, and for the first time since she had walked into his office, something like genuine curiosity crossed his features. "You're different from the others." "I'm just trying to keep my job," Elena said, though the words felt smaller than the truth. The truth was that something about this man unsettled her in ways she didn't want to examine too closely, a magnetic pull she recognized as dangerous the moment she felt it. By the end of the first week, Elena had learned the rhythm of the office well enough to anticipate Salvatore's needs before he voiced them, bringing him coffee exactly the way he liked it, without being told twice, rescheduling meetings the moment she sensed tension building in a room, deflecting calls from people whose voices carried threats disguised as pleasantries. Vittoria noticed. She cornered Elena near the elevator on Friday evening, her expression unreadable. "You're still here," Vittoria said. "I told you, I need the job. That's not why you're still here." Vittoria's eyes narrowed, studying Elena with the same assessing quality her brother had shown on the first day. The others were scared off within days. "You've watched a man threaten my brother's life, listened to conversations that would get most people killed for simply overhearing them, and you haven't packed a single box." "Maybe I'm just stubborn." "Maybe," Vittoria said, though her tone suggested she didn't believe it. "Be careful, Elena. My brother doesn't let people close to him. The ones who get close don't always stay safe." The warning settled into Elena's chest like a stone, but she found she couldn't heed it, not fully. There was something about the way Salvatore looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, something guarded and lonely beneath all that cold authority, that made her want to stay far longer than good sense should have allowed. The following Monday brought a new kind of tension into the office. Salvatore arrived earlier than usual, his expression harder than Elena had seen it before, and he called Nino into his office for a conversation that lasted nearly an hour behind closed doors. When they finally emerged, Nino's face was grim, and Salvatore's hands were clenched at his sides in a way that told Elena something significant had shifted. "Cancel my afternoon," he told her, not stopping as he strode past her desk. "All of it?" "All of it." He paused at the door, turning back to look at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "And Elena, if anyone calls asking for me today who isn't already in my contacts, you don't answer, you don't take a message, you hang up immediately. Understood?" He studied her for another moment, as though weighing whether to say more, before he simply nodded and left. Elena sat at her desk long after the door closed, her mind racing through everything she had witnessed in the past week, piecing together fragments of a picture she was only beginning to understand. Costa Enterprises was not simply dangerous. It was at war, quietly and viciously, with forces Elena couldn't yet name, and she had walked directly into the middle of it, without any idea what she was risking. That evening, as she gathered her things to leave, she found Salvatore standing at the window of his office, staring down at the street below with an expression of such profound exhaustion that it startled her. She hesitated in the doorway, uncertain whether to interrupt or simply leave quietly. "You can go home," he said, without turning around, apparently having heard her despite her silence. "Are you all right?" The question seemed to surprise him. He turned slowly, and for a moment, the cold mask he wore so consistently slipped, revealing something rawer underneath, something tired and human that made her chest ache with an emotion she didn't have a name for. "No one has asked me that in a very long time," he admitted quietly. "I'm asking now." He studied her for a long moment, and Elena felt the weight of his gaze settle over her like something physical. "You should be careful, Elena Marchetti. Curiosity about my life tends to be a dangerous habit." "Then it's a good thing I've never been very good at minding my own business." Something almost like a laugh escaped him, brief and surprised, as though he hadn't expected to feel anything close to amusement that day. "Go home," he said again, softer this time. "Rest. Tomorrow will not be easy." Elena left the building that night with her mind full of questions she knew better than to ask aloud, and a strange, unwelcome warmth in her chest that told her she was already in far deeper than 3 months probation should have allowed. She thought of Vittoria's warning as she walked to her car, of the bullet hole still visible in the lobby wall, of the exhaustion in Salvatore's eyes when he thought no one was watching him closely enough to notice. She should have been afraid. Part of her was. But a larger part of her, the part that had refused to run on her very first day despite gunfire and warnings and every rational instinct screaming at her to leave, was already wondering what tomorrow would bring, and whether she was strong enough to survive whatever storm was building around Salvatore Costa and the empire he ruled, with equal parts precision and quiet devastation. As she drove home through the city lights, she caught herself glancing in the rearview mirror more than once, a habit she had never needed before this week. Somewhere behind her, in an office of dark wood and reinforced glass, a man who had buried 12 assistants' resignation letters in the past year sat alone with his exhaustion, and Elena Marchetti, against every warning and every instinct of self-preservation, found herself already wondering how she might ease some of that weight from his shoulders the next morning. She had come to Costa Enterprises for a paycheck. She was beginning to suspect she would leave with far more than money, if she left at all. Sleep did not come easily that night. Elena lay in the darkness of her small apartment, staring at the ceiling while her mind replayed every detail of the day, from the bullet hole in the lobby wall to the strange tenderness she had glimpsed in Salvatore's eyes before he caught himself and hid it away again. She thought about calling her sister, the only family she had left in the city, just to hear a familiar voice, but she stopped herself before dialing, unsure how she would explain any of it without sounding as though she had lost her mind entirely. Instead, she made a cup of tea she barely touched and sat by her window, watching the street below for any sign of the danger Salvatore had warned her about. Nothing moved except a stray cat weaving between parked cars and the distant hum of traffic from the main road. Eventually, exhaustion won out over fear, and she drifted into a restless sleep filled with fragmented images of dark hallways and quiet, watchful eyes. She arrived early the next morning, earlier than she needed to, driven by a restlessness she couldn't quite name. The lobby had been repaired overnight, the bullet hole patched and painted so seamlessly that a stranger would never have known violence had visited the building just days before. Elena found herself staring at the spot anyway, remembering the sound of the shot, the way her body had refused to run, even when every rational thought told her to. Vittoria caught her staring as she stepped off the elevator. "They're fast with repairs," she said, following Elena's gaze. "Practice, unfortunately." "How often does something like that happen?" "Often enough that we have a company on retainer just for the walls." Vittoria's tone was light, almost joking, but there was something brittle beneath it, a weariness Elena hadn't noticed before. "You get used to it, or you don't, and you leave. There's no middle ground in this family." "Which one are you?" Elena asked before she could stop herself. Vittoria's expression flickered, something old and tired passing behind her eyes. "I stopped being able to leave a long time ago. Family isn't something you resign from, no matter how much you might want to some days." She studied Elena for a moment longer, then shook her head, as though clearing away a thought she didn't want to finish. "Get to work. My brother doesn't like when his desk isn't cleared by 9. The days that followed settled into a strange new rhythm, one built around careful vigilance, disguised as ordinary office routine. Elena learned to recognize the particular silence that fell over the floor whenever a certain kind of visitor arrived, learned which phone lines required extra caution, learned to keep a note of every unfamiliar face that passed through reception, though no one had explicitly asked her to do so. It simply seemed like the responsible thing to do, given everything she had already witnessed. Salvatore watched her adapt with something like quiet approval, though he rarely offered praise outright. Instead, he began entrusting her with small pieces of information he had withheld from previous assistants, testing, perhaps, how she would handle the weight of knowing more than was safe. She never flinched, never asked more questions than necessary, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the distance between them began to narrow, replaced by something neither of them had a name for yet, but both could feel building steadily beneath the surface of every careful, measured conversation. The phone on Elena's desk rang at exactly 6 in the morning, hours before she normally arrived, and she nearly dropped her coffee reaching for it because the office had given her a direct line only Salvatore and Nino were supposed to use. Nino's voice on the other end was clipped and urgent, telling her to get to the building immediately and to take the back entrance, not the main lobby. She didn't ask why. She simply grabbed her keys and ran. The back entrance was crawling with more security than she had ever seen, men she didn't recognize standing at intervals along the corridor, their eyes scanning every person who passed. When she reached the top floor, she found Salvatore pacing behind his desk, his tie loosened, dark circles beneath his eyes, suggesting he had not slept at all. "There was an attempt on my life last night," he said before she could even ask. "Someone tried to get into my home. Nino stopped them before they got past the gate." Elena's stomach dropped. "Are you hurt?" "No." He stopped pacing and looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. "You're asking about my safety before you ask about your own. That's either very brave or very foolish." "Maybe it's both," Elena said, setting her bag down and moving toward her desk, as though the world hadn't just tilted sideways again. "What do you need from me today?" He watched her for a long moment, as if trying to understand why she hadn't simply turned around and walked back out the door. "I need you to reschedule everything again, and I need you to stay close. Don't leave the building without Nino or myself accompanying you." "Am I in danger?" "Everyone close to me is in danger," he said flatly. "That's the truth I should have told you on your first day, before you decided to stay." Elena absorbed the weight of that admission, feeling the fear settle into her bones even as something stubborn and unwilling to retreat rose up beside it. "Then I suppose it's a good thing I already know how to duck when bullets fly." He almost smiled again, that same rare and fleeting expression she had begun to recognize and, if she was honest with herself, begun to look forward to seeing. "You are either the bravest assistant I have ever hired, or the most reckless." "Can't it be both?" "Apparently everything about you can be both," he murmured, and turned back to the window, leaving Elena to wonder what exactly he meant by that. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of tension and careful routine. Elena learned to read the mood of the building the moment she stepped off the elevator, could tell within seconds whether the day would be calm or chaotic simply by the number of men stationed in the hallway. She learned which calls to intercept and which to pass through immediately, learned the code names Salvatore used for his most trusted associates, learned to recognize the particular stillness that settled over him whenever bad news arrived, a stillness far more unsettling than any outburst could have been. Nino began speaking to her more openly as the days passed, though always with a note of caution in his voice, as though he expected her to eventually break under the strain the way every assistant before her had. On a quiet afternoon, while Salvatore was locked in a meeting with two men Elena didn't recognize, Nino found her in the small kitchen off the main office, staring out the window with a cup of untouched tea in her hands. "You should think about leaving," Nino said quietly, closing the door behind him. Elena turned, surprised by the directness of his tone. "Is that a threat?" "It's a warning. The kind I give because I like you, not because anyone told me to." He leaned against the counter, his broad frame filling the small space. "No one lasts this long. The ones who tried to get close to him before, they didn't end well." "What happened to them?" Nino's jaw tightened. "Some left on their own, smart enough to see the danger before it swallowed them whole. Others weren't as lucky." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Salvatore doesn't let people in easily. But when he does, the people who want him gone will see that as a weakness to exploit. Do you understand what I'm telling you? The weight of his words settled over Elena like a physical thing. You're saying if he cares about someone, that person becomes a target. I'm saying you should think very carefully about how close you let yourself get, Nino said, and left the kitchen without waiting for a response, leaving Elena alone with a cooling cup of tea and a rising sense of dread she couldn't quite shake. That evening, as the office emptied and the sky outside darkened into deep blue, Elena found herself lingering longer than necessary, organizing files that didn't need organizing, searching for reasons to stay just a little longer in the quiet building. Salvatore emerged from his office, just as she was preparing to finally leave, his expression softer than she had seen it in days, the harsh lines of exhaustion momentarily eased. "You're still here," he observed. "So are you." He allowed himself a small, tired laugh, the sound unfamiliar and warm in a way that made Elena's chest tighten. "I suppose neither of us knows how to leave things unfinished." "Nino talked to me today," Elena said before she could stop herself. "He told me to be careful. About getting close to you." Something shifted in Salvatore's expression, the warmth retreating slightly, replaced by something more guarded. "He's not wrong. I didn't say he was. But you're still here. I told you before, I'm stubborn." Salvatore studied her for a long moment, and Elena felt as though he were peeling back every layer of composure she had carefully constructed, seeing straight through to the fear and fascination tangled together beneath. "The people I've lost, Elena, they didn't die because they were weak. They died because someone wanted to hurt me, and hurting them was the easiest way to do it." His voice had dropped, quieter than she had ever heard it. "I won't apologize for the life I lead, but I also won't pretend it doesn't come with a cost that isn't only mine to pay." "Is that your way of telling me to quit?" "It's my way of telling you the truth, since apparently no one has bothered to do that for you yet." He moved closer, close enough that Elena could see the exhaustion etched into every line of his face, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him despite the coldness he wore like armor around everyone else. "If you're smart, you'll take the warning seriously. And if I'm not smart, then you'll stay, and I'll have to live with knowing I let you." The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither of them named, until the shrill ring of Salvatore's phone shattered the silence. He answered it with visible reluctance, his expression hardening back into the mask Elena had grown accustomed to as he listened to whatever news the caller delivered. When he hung up, his jaw was tight with barely restrained anger. "The Ferraro family sent a message tonight," he said. "They want a meeting. They claim they have information about who's been targeting me. Do you believe them?" "I don't believe anyone in this business without proof." He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture betraying more stress than his voice let on. "But I can't afford to ignore it either." "When is the meeting?" "Tomorrow. Neutral ground, or so they claim." He looked at her, something protective flickering across his features. "You'll stay here, with Nino. I don't want you anywhere near this." "Salvatore. This isn't a negotiation, Elena." His voice carried an authority that brooked no argument, though beneath it, she could hear something that sounded almost like fear, not for himself, but for her. "I've already lost people I care about to this life. I won't lose you too." The admission hung in the air between them, unspoken feelings suddenly spoken aloud without either of them quite meaning to say them so plainly. Elena's breath caught, her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized the depth of what he had just revealed. The crack in his armor wide enough now that she could see straight through to the man beneath the boss, a man who was, despite every warning and every danger surrounding him, beginning to care for her every bit as much as she had already begun to care for him. "Be careful tomorrow," she said softly, unable to find any other words adequate to the moment. "I will." He hesitated, then reached out, his fingers brushing against hers for the briefest moment, before he pulled back, as though even that small contact was a risk he hadn't fully decided to take. "Go home, Elena. Lock your doors. I'll have someone watching the street tonight, just in case." She left the building with her mind spinning, the memory of his fingers against hers lingering long after she had driven away into the night. She understood now, more clearly than ever, exactly what kind of danger she had walked into weeks earlier when she accepted this job. and exactly why every assistant before her had fled rather than face it. At home, she found she couldn't settle. She paced her small living room, checked the locks on her windows twice, and finally gave up on any pretense of calm, sitting instead at her kitchen table with a notebook she used for grocery lists, writing down everything she could remember about the Ferraro family from the fragments of conversation she had overheard over the past weeks. She wasn't sure why she felt compelled to do it, only that the restless energy in her chest demanded some kind of outlet, some way of feeling less helpless while the man she had begun to care for walked toward danger she couldn't follow him into. Her phone buzzed near midnight, a message from an unknown number that made her heart stop until she realized it was Nino, using a temporary line for security. The message was brief. "Everything is arranged. He will be careful. Get some rest." She read it 3 times before setting the phone down, some of the tension in her shoulders easing slightly, though sleep still refused to come easily. Morning arrived gray and overcast, matching the knot of anxiety that had settled permanently in Elena's stomach. She dressed carefully, choosing clothes that felt like armor, even though she knew appearance changed nothing about the danger unfolding somewhere across the city. When she arrived at the office, Vittoria was already there, pacing near the window with a phone pressed to her ear, her voice sharp and urgent, in a way Elena hadn't heard before. "Any word?" Elena asked once Vittoria ended the call. "Not yet." Vittoria's composure had cracked slightly, revealing the fear she usually kept so carefully hidden behind sharp words and cool assessments. The meeting was supposed to start 20 minutes ago. Nino was meant to check in immediately after. The two women sat together in tense silence, neither quite willing to voice the fear building between them, until Vittoria's phone finally rang again, and the relief that washed across her face told Elena everything before a single word was spoken. "They're at the safe house," Vittoria said, already reaching for her coat. "Come on, my brother is asking for you specifically." The drive across town felt endless, every red light an agony of waiting, every block bringing them closer to answers Elena wasn't entirely sure she was prepared to face. She thought of every warning Nino and Vittoria had given her, every reason she should have walked away weeks ago, when this had still been nothing more than a difficult job with excellent pay, and she understood now, with complete clarity, that it was far too late for any of those warnings to matter anymore. Elena's phone buzzed against the nightstand at 4 in the morning, and she was awake and answering before the second ring, her heart already racing with dread. It was Nino, his voice tight with restrained urgency, telling her that Salvatore's meeting had gone sideways, and that she needed to come to the safe house across town immediately, not the office. She dressed in the dark, hands trembling as she fumbled with buttons, and drove through empty streets with a fear so sharp it felt like something physical lodged beneath her ribs. The safe house was a nondescript building, tucked between a shuttered bakery and an old apartment complex, guarded by 2 men who checked her identification twice before letting her inside. She found Salvatore in a small back room, a bandage wrapped around his upper arm, his shirt stained with blood that had already begun to dry. Relief and terror crashed through her at the same time, so overwhelming she had to grip the doorframe to steady herself. "You're hurt," she breathed, crossing the room before she could stop herself. "It's a graze," he said, though the tightness in his voice suggested it hurt far more than he was willing to admit. The meeting was a trap. The Ferraro family never intended to give us information. They wanted me in a room without my full guard. Nino? He got me out before it turned into something worse. Salvatore's eyes met hers, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw something raw and unguarded there, an exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness. "I told you not to come here." "I couldn't stay away," Elena admitted, kneeling beside him to examine the bandage with hands that hadn't stopped shaking. "Let me help." He didn't argue, which told her more about how much pain he was truly in than any words could have. She worked in silence, cleaning the wound properly, her fingers steady, despite the chaos of her thoughts, and when she finished, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "Why do you keep staying?" he asked quietly. "Every warning I've given you, every danger you've witnessed, and you keep choosing to stay." "I don't have a good answer for that," Elena admitted. "Maybe I never did." "Maybe I don't want you to have an answer," he said, so quietly she almost missed it, and something in his voice told her he meant it, as more than simple words, that the walls he had built so carefully around himself were beginning to crumble in ways neither of them had fully anticipated. Vittoria arrived an hour later, her expression thunderous when she found Elena still at her brother's side. She pulled Elena aside the moment she had the chance, her voice low and sharp. "This is exactly what I warned you about," Vittoria hissed. "You're becoming a target simply by being near him. Do you understand that?" "I understand the risk," Elena said steadily. "Do you? Because from where I'm standing, you're falling for a man who cannot promise you safety, cannot promise you a future that doesn't end in tragedy, and you're doing it with your eyes wide open." Vittoria's expression softened slightly, some of the anger giving way to something closer to worry. "I don't dislike you, Elena. That's precisely why I'm telling you to leave before it's too late." "And if I don't want to leave?" Vittoria studied her for a long moment before sighing, defeat evident in the set of her shoulders. "Then you'd better be as strong as you seem to think you are, because what's coming will test you in ways you can't imagine." The days following the ambush brought a new intensity to the office. Security tightened to levels Elena hadn't previously seen. Every visitor searched twice before being allowed near Salvatore's office. He grew more withdrawn during business hours, the walls he had briefly let down at the safe house rebuilt with even greater care, though Elena noticed he found reasons to keep her close throughout the day, small requests that didn't quite need making, brief conversations that lingered longer than necessary. One evening, as the office quieted and most of the staff had gone home, Elena found him standing at the window again, staring down at the city with an expression she was beginning to recognize as deep contemplation. "I have something to tell you," he said without turning around. "Information came in today. The people behind the ambush, behind everything that's happened these past weeks, they're not simply trying to eliminate me, they're trying to take over the entire operation, which means anyone connected to me becomes valuable as leverage." Elena's stomach twisted. "Leverage how?" "They could try to take you," he said bluntly, finally turning to face her, his expression grim. "To force my hand. It's happened before, to other people in this life." "Then what do we do?" "I want to send you away, somewhere safe, until this is resolved." "No," Elena said immediately, surprising herself with the force of her own refusal. "Elena." "I said no." She crossed the room to stand before him, her chin lifted despite the fear churning in her stomach. "I didn't run when I heard gunfire on my first day. I didn't run when Nino warned me. I didn't run when you told me people close to you don't survive well. I'm not running now." Salvatore's expression shifted through several emotions in quick succession, frustration and fear, and something that looked remarkably like tenderness settling over his features as he studied her. "You are the most stubborn woman I have ever known. You've mentioned that before. I mean it as the highest compliment," he said softly, closing the distance between them until barely a breath separated their bodies. "I have spent months, years, surrounding myself with people who fear me too much to ever truly see me. You walked into gunfire and looked past all of it straight to the man underneath, and I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it," Elena whispered, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he could hear it. "You just have to let it exist." His hand rose to cup her face, his touch far gentler than she would have expected from a man capable of such ruthless control over everything around him. "If something happens to you because of me, then it happens because I chose to stay, not because you failed to protect me," Elena interrupted, covering his hand with her own. "I make my own choices, Salvatore. This is one of them." The kiss that followed was slow and searching, carrying within it every unspoken fear and hope that had built between them over the past weeks. A moment of tenderness, carved out of chaos, that neither of them had expected to find in the middle of a war, neither had chosen, but both were now committed to surviving together. When they finally broke apart, Salvatore rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady. "This changes things," he murmured. "I know. It makes you more of a target, not less. I know that too." Elena pulled back just enough to meet his eyes, her own filled with a determination that startled even her. "But I would rather face that danger standing beside you than spend the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I had run when everyone told me to." Outside, the city lights flickered against the darkening sky, indifferent to the quiet transformation happening within the walls of Costa Enterprises, where a curvy girl who had once walked in looking only for a paycheck now stood at the center of a war she had never asked to join, bound to a man whose enemies would soon learn exactly how far he was willing to go to protect what he had finally allowed himself to want. Over the following days, their new closeness settled into something neither of them tried to hide, though they remained careful in front of the staff, aware that any weakness noticed by the wrong eyes could be used against them both. Nino noticed anyway, of course, offering Elena a knowing look one morning that carried no judgment, only quiet acknowledgement of a shift he had clearly been expecting for weeks. "You're good for him," Nino said simply, catching her alone near the coffee machine. "I haven't seen him this settled in years. Even with everything happening around us. I'm terrified I'll be the reason something happens to him," Elena admitted, the fear she had been carrying silently, finally finding voice. "Everyone close to him carries that fear," Nino said, his tone gentler than she had ever heard it. "It comes with loving someone in this life, but fear like that, it doesn't mean you should walk away. It means you understand exactly what you're choosing to protect." His words stayed with her throughout the day, settling into something steadier than the anxiety that had gripped her since the ambush. That evening, Salvatore found her reviewing security reports at her desk, long after she should have gone home, her brow furrowed in concentration as she cross-referenced names against a list Nino had compiled. "You don't have to do this," he said softly, settling into the chair across from her. "I want to understand what we're facing, all of it, not just the parts you think are safe for me to know." He studied her for a long moment before nodding, something like respect flickering across his features. "All right. Then let me show you properly, instead of leaving you to piece it together from fragments." He pulled his chair closer, and for the next hour, he walked her through the true shape of the threat surrounding them, holding nothing back, treating her not as someone to be protected from the truth, but as someone capable of standing beside him within it. It was, Elena realized as she listened, the greatest gift he had given her yet, greater even than the kiss they had shared days earlier, because it meant he finally trusted her with the weight of who he truly was. Neither of them could have known, in that fragile moment of tenderness, just how soon that resolve would be tested, or how close they were to losing everything they had only just begun to build. The world went dark for Elena somewhere between the parking garage and her car, a cloth pressed hard over her mouth and nose before she could even scream, strong arms hauling her backward into a vehicle that sped away, before she fully understood what was happening to her. When she woke, her wrists were bound, and her head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, and the room around her was dim, lit only by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Two men stood near the door, speaking in low voices, occasionally glancing her way with expressions that told her exactly how little her comfort mattered to them. She forced herself to breathe steadily, to catalog every detail of the room despite the fear clawing at her chest, the way she had once read that people should do in moments of crisis. Concrete walls, a single door, no windows she could see. Wherever she was, it had been chosen precisely because escape would be difficult. "She's awake," one of the men said, noticing her open eyes. He crouched before her, his expression cold. "You're going to be useful, sweetheart. Costa cares about you, which means he'll do exactly what we tell him to get you back. He won't negotiate with people who ambush his employees," Elena said, forcing steel into her voice despite the tremor she couldn't quite suppress. The man laughed, low and humorless. "We'll see how principled he stays once he sees what happens to you if he doesn't cooperate." Fear threatened to swallow her whole, but Elena forced it down, forced herself to think rather than panic. She studied the ropes binding her wrists, testing their give when the men weren't looking directly at her, cataloging every possible advantage, no matter how small. Hours passed in the dim room, punctuated by hushed conversations she couldn't fully hear and the occasional buzz of a phone that made both men tense with anticipation. She thought of Salvatore, of the kiss they had shared just days earlier, of the way he had looked at her as though she were something precious he had never expected to find. She refused to believe that moment would be the last thing between them. She refused to simply wait to be rescued, like a helpless prize in someone else's war. When one of the men finally left the room to take a call, leaving the other distracted by his phone, Elena worked quickly, twisting her wrists against the rope in a pattern she remembered from an old survival documentary, ignoring the burn of rope against skin, until finally, blessedly, her hands slipped free. She moved silently, using the element of surprise to her advantage, striking the distracted guard hard enough to send him stumbling before she bolted for the door, adrenaline overriding every instinct that told her to be afraid. She made it into a hallway lined with more doors, disorientation threatening to overwhelm her sense of direction, when the sound of shouting erupted from somewhere behind her. She ran anyway, following the faint hint of daylight leaking through a door at the end of the corridor, her lungs burning, her bound ankles from earlier bruises slowing her pace but not stopping her entirely. The door led to a loading area, and beyond it, chaos had already arrived. Gunfire echoed against concrete walls as familiar faces moved through the space with brutal efficiency, and Elena's heart leapt as she recognized Nino, cutting down the distance between them with long, urgent strides. Salvatore close behind him, his expression a mixture of fury and desperate relief the moment his eyes found her. Elena, his voice cracked with an emotion she had never heard from him before, something raw and unguarded that stripped away every ounce of the cold control he wore so carefully in front of everyone else. He reached her in seconds, pulling her against his chest with a force that spoke of terror, only now beginning to ease. "I thought, I'm here," she said against his shoulder, her own voice shaking now that the adrenaline was beginning to fade, replaced by the full weight of everything she had just survived. "I'm okay. You escaped on your own," he said, pulling back just enough to study her face, disbelief and pride mingling in his expression. "You didn't wait for us." "I wasn't going to sit there and hope someone would save me," Elena said, and despite the exhaustion and fear still coursing through her, something fierce and proud rose up beneath it all. "I told you, I make my own choices." Nino secured the area behind them, ensuring the remaining threats had been neutralized, while Salvatore guided Elena away from the building, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders, as though he couldn't bear to let even an inch of distance separate them now. In the car, once they were finally safe and moving toward the safe house, the walls he had spent years constructing around his emotions crumbled entirely. "I have never been so afraid in my life," he admitted, his voice low and rough. "Not when I've faced down men with guns, not when I've buried people I cared about. Nothing has ever frightened me the way losing you did." "You didn't lose me," Elena said softly, reaching for his hand. "I could have. Because of who I am, because of the life I lead, I could have lost you completely, and there would have been nothing I could have done to bring you back." He turned to look at her, his eyes filled with an intensity that stole her breath. "I have spent my entire life believing that caring for someone was a weakness I couldn't afford. Watching you disappear today taught me something far more terrifying. Not caring for you was never truly an option. I was already too far gone before I even realized it." Elena's chest tightened with emotion she couldn't fully articulate, the fear of the past hours finally giving way to something warmer, something that felt suspiciously like hope despite every danger still surrounding them. "Then don't fight it anymore," she whispered. "Neither of us can control what we feel. We can only decide what to do about it." Salvatore's hand tightened around hers, and for the first time since she had walked into his office weeks earlier, expecting nothing more than a paycheck and a difficult boss, Elena saw something in his eyes that looked entirely unguarded, entirely honest. A man finally willing to admit that the walls he had built to protect himself had never truly kept him safe at all, only alone. "The people responsible for this will not survive what comes next," he said quietly, the softness in his voice giving way to something harder, more resolute. "I have been patient. I have tried to handle this quietly, to minimize the damage to everyone around me. That patience ends today. What are you going to do?" "Whatever it takes to make sure no one ever thinks they can use you against me again," he said, and Elena, despite every instinct that told her to fear the darkness in his voice, found herself trusting him completely, trusting that whatever came next, they would face it together rather than apart. The safe house welcomed them back with tightened security and grim-faced men awaiting instructions, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Elena felt something close to peace settle over her exhausted body as Salvatore refused to release her hand, even as he began issuing commands that would set in motion the final confrontation with the enemies who had dared to threaten what he had only just allowed himself to claim as his own. A doctor arrived within the hour to examine her, checking the bruises on her wrists and the small cut above her eyebrow she hadn't even noticed until he pointed it out. Salvatore stood in the corner of the room throughout the examination, arms crossed, his eyes never leaving her, as though he needed constant visual proof that she was truly safe before he could allow himself to fully breathe again. When the doctor finally left, declaring her shaken but otherwise unharmed, Salvatore crossed the room in 3 quick strides and pulled her against him once more, burying his face in her hair. "I need to tell you something," he murmured against her ear. "Something I should have told you weeks ago, before any of this happened." "Tell me now," Elena said, pulling back just enough to see his face. "I love you." The words came out rough, almost reluctant, as though he had been holding them back so long that releasing them cost him something physical. "I have loved you since the 2nd week, when you looked at me after that man screamed threats in my office and asked if I was all right instead of asking what was happening. I didn't want to believe it at first. I told myself it was simply gratitude, or curiosity, or anything other than what it actually was. Watching you disappear today made lying to myself impossible." Tears filled Elena's eyes, the exhaustion and fear of the day finally breaking loose into something warmer and far more overwhelming. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have for longer than I want to admit." Nino found them still wrapped around each other 20 minutes later, and rather than his usual measured composure, he allowed himself a small, genuine smile. "The perimeter is secure," he reported. "We have people watching every location connected to the group that took her. Whoever gave the order to grab Elena will be found within the day." "Good," Salvatore said, though he made no move to release Elena from his embrace. "Make sure they understand exactly why this happened to them, before it's finished." The following hours passed in a blur of hushed conversations and careful planning, Elena present for all of it now, exactly as she had insisted. She watched Salvatore transform before her eyes from the tender, frightened man who had held her so desperately just hours earlier, into the calculating, formidable leader who had built and protected an empire through sheer force of will and strategic precision. Both versions of him, she realized, were equally true, equally part of the man she had fallen in love with despite every warning that should have sent her running in the opposite direction. Sirens wailed somewhere in the distance as Elena stood at the window of the safe house 3 days after her rescue, watching the sun rise over a city that had nearly cost her everything, and she felt for the first time in weeks that the danger pressing down on her chest had finally begun to lift. The Ferraro family's operation had collapsed overnight, its leadership dismantled through a combination of strategic pressure and information that Salvatore had spent years quietly gathering for exactly this kind of moment. He had not told her the full details of what happened, and she had not asked, understanding instinctively that some things were better left unspoken between them. Salvatore found her there, watching the sunrise, and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin against the top of her head, with a tenderness that still felt new and precious after everything they had endured to reach it. "It's over," he said quietly. "The threat is gone. You're safe now." "Are you safe?" Elena asked, turning within his embrace to study his face, searching for any lingering shadows of the danger that had haunted him for weeks. "Safer than I've been in years," he admitted, and something in his expression told her he meant it in more ways than one. "I spent so long believing that keeping people at a distance was the only way to protect them. You taught me that distance never protected anyone. It only left me alone while the danger found its way to the people I cared about regardless." Vittoria arrived later that morning, her expression carrying none of the sharp disapproval Elena had grown accustomed to over the past weeks. Instead, she studied Elena with something closer to grudging respect, the kind earned only through surviving exactly the kind of trial she had once warned would come. "You escaped on your own," Vittoria said, crossing her arms as she leaned against the doorframe. "Most people in your position would have simply waited to be saved." "I've never been very good at waiting," Elena replied. A small, reluctant smile tugged at the corner of Vittoria's mouth. "No, I suppose you haven't." She glanced toward her brother, who stood close enough to Elena that the intimacy between them was impossible to miss. "I owe you an apology. I spent weeks trying to convince you to leave because I believed you would only become another casualty in this life. I underestimated exactly how strong you actually are." "Apology accepted," Elena said, surprised by the genuine warmth in Vittoria's expression. "Just promise me one thing," Vittoria added, her tone softening further. "Take care of him. He has spent so many years convincing himself that he doesn't deserve happiness, that caring for someone only puts them in danger. Someone needs to convince him otherwise, and I think you might actually be capable of it." Elena glanced at Salvatore, finding him watching her with an expression of such open vulnerability that her heart ached with the fullness of what had grown between them over these tumultuous weeks. "I intend to," she said softly, and meant every word. The following weeks brought a gradual return to something resembling normalcy, though normalcy for Costa Enterprises still meant careful security and constant vigilance. Elena resumed her position at Salvatore's side, though the nature of their relationship had transformed entirely from what it had been on that first terrifying day in the lobby. She no longer merely managed his calendar and deflected difficult calls. She had become someone he consulted on decisions both large and small, someone whose opinion he genuinely valued, someone he trusted in ways he had never trusted anyone else in his adult life. One evening, as the office quieted and the last of the staff filtered out into the cool autumn air, Salvatore called Elena into his office with a formality that struck her as unusual, given how relaxed their dynamic had become in recent weeks. "I have something for you," he said, gesturing for her to sit across from him at the desk, where their entire complicated relationship had first begun. "Should I be worried?" Elena asked, only half joking, old habits from those early frightening weeks not entirely faded. "No," he said, a genuine smile breaking across his features, an expression so rare and beautiful that it still caught her off guard every time she witnessed it. "I've been thinking about how we started, about that first day when you sat across from me and refused to run, despite gunfire in the lobby. I told you then that you had the position on probation, that we would discuss permanent terms if you survived 3 months. I remember. The 3 months ended last week," he said, sliding a folder across the desk toward her. "I want to offer you something different than what we originally discussed." Elena opened the folder to find a document that had nothing to do with secretarial duties, a formal position that placed her directly at his side in matters of the business, a role built entirely around the trust and partnership that had grown between them despite every danger that had tried to tear it apart. "Salvatore, It's what you've already been doing," he interrupted gently. "I'm simply making it official. You've earned this, Elena, not because of what happened between us, but because you've proven yourself capable of handling every challenge this life has thrown at you, and because I trust your judgment more than I trust my own, most days." Tears pricked at Elena's eyes as she studied the document, the weight of everything they had survived together settling over her with a bittersweet fullness. "I accept," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "though I have one condition." "Name it." "No more secrets about the dangerous parts. If something threatens us, I want to know. I want to face it beside you, not be protected from it like something fragile that needs shielding." Salvatore studied her for a long moment, weighing her request with the seriousness it deserved. "That goes against every instinct I have to protect you." "I know. But partnership means facing things together, not one person carrying all the weight alone." Elena reached across the desk, taking his hand in hers. "You don't have to be alone anymore, Salvatore. Not with the danger, and not with anything else." Something shifted in his expression, a final wall crumbling away as he brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss against her knuckles with a tenderness that spoke louder than any words could have managed. "Agreed," he said softly. "No more secrets. No more facing things alone." Outside the window, the city lights flickered against the darkening sky, indifferent to the transformation that had taken place within these walls over the past months, a transformation that had turned a desperate job seeker into an indispensable partner, and a cold, guarded boss into a man finally willing to let someone stand beside him rather than merely serve him. Elena thought back to that first terrifying day, to the bullet hole in the lobby wall and the cold assessment in Salvatore's eyes, and marveled at how far they had both traveled since then. 12 assistants had come before her, each one fleeing within days or weeks, unable to withstand the danger and the demands of a life lived so close to the edge. Elena Marchetti had done more than simply survive. She had claimed a place for herself within that dangerous world, had claimed a place within the heart of a man who had convinced himself he was incapable of truly letting anyone in. Later that evening, they walked together through the quiet garden behind Salvatore's home, the autumn air cool against Elena's skin, the tension of the past months finally beginning to loosen its grip on both of them. Vittoria had joined them for dinner, the three of them sharing a meal without a single interruption from business, for the first time since Elena had started working there. And something about the ordinary comfort of that evening felt more precious than any grand gesture could have managed. "What happens now?" Elena asked, as they paused beside a small stone fountain, the water catching the last light of the setting sun. "Now we build something neither of us has ever had," Salvatore said, turning to face her fully. "A life that isn't only about survival. I won't pretend the danger disappears entirely, Elena. This world doesn't work that way, but I intend to spend every day making sure you never regret choosing to stay." "I never will," Elena said with complete certainty, "not for a single moment." He reached into his jacket then, producing a small velvet box that he opened with hands that, for the first time since she had known him, trembled slightly. "I know it soon. I know everything about how we began was chaotic and dangerous, and nothing like how these things are supposed to happen. But I have never been more certain of anything than I am of this." Elena's breath caught as she stared at the ring inside the box, simple and elegant, nothing showy or extravagant, exactly the kind of choice she would have made for herself. "Salvatore, marry me," he said simply, no elaborate speech, no dramatic flourish, just the raw honesty that had defined every genuine moment between them since that first terrifying day in the lobby. "Stand beside me, not just as my partner in business, but as my partner in everything. Give me the chance to spend the rest of my life proving that you made the right choice by staying." "Yes," Elena said, tears streaming freely down her face now as he slid the ring onto her finger with careful, reverent hands. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." He pulled her into his arms, and as the last light of day faded into evening around them, Elena Marchetti, who had walked into Costa Enterprises months earlier expecting nothing more than a difficult job and a decent paycheck, found herself standing instead at the beginning of an entirely different life, one built on danger survived together, trust earned through fire, and a love neither of them had believed themselves capable of finding. As Salvatore pulled her from her chair and into his arms earlier that day, sealing their new beginning with a kiss that carried within it every fear they had overcome together, Elena knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges still waited for them in the future, they would face every single one of them side by side, exactly as partners should, bound now not only by love but by a promise neither of them intended ever to break.